Go ahead and record, I think. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my session today. My name is Rebekah Bennetch, and I'm going to be leading us through, I hope, some useful reflections about what it means to be a teacher in trying times. So something I've really appreciated about this group of Equity Unbound is just the generosity this group has in sharing and reflecting on challenging things, but also having a lot of hope. And that's kind of what I'm hoping that this session will lead to us. And to kind of echo what Ken and May have already mentioned, I really invite you to participate at the level of your comfort. I really am going to be asking a lot of, deeper personal questions, and so please don't feel obligated to share. But I hope you feel safe enough to share some of the themes that we will be exploring today. So they're in the chat here. I will pop in the slides that we'll be using for today. I will share my screen in just a moment. But I there will be an activity a little bit later where I'll ask you to actually edit the Google slide. So you might want to keep that link a little bit handy. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Let me make sure I got my sound on. Okay. Let's go here. All right. Can everyone see my slides? Hopefully. Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you. Awesome. I do like to keep I have a little window open on the side where I see faces. And so if you are comfortable having your camera on, I do like seeing little friendly faces in the corner as I'm talking. So I don't feel like I'm just speaking to the void, as we all know what that feels like. As I mentioned, my name is Rebekah Bennetch. I am a new PhD, only just a couple of months. Thankfully, it's just a long road to walk. But what I'm going to be sharing with you today is some of the results of my thinking around this work that I've done. This work has meant a lot to me personally, and I'm really hoping to take this work and share it with others because I think some of the things that I've learned on this path that I've taken could be helpful for other people who are struggling. So, as I mentioned, my name is Rebekah Bennetch. I'm coming to you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, which is the homeland of the Métis people. It's also the homeland of all the Treaty 6 peoples. So I always like to start with a little bit of a land acknowledgement because no matter where you are in the world, you're on the land of someone who has come before. So another thing I really appreciate about this organization is I know that no matter what, I'm talking to a minimum of at least 3 different continents. And I think that's such a cool thing about our community is that we're all so international. We all have these different lands that we connect to. A big part of my argument has to do with landscapes. And I like to think of landscapes as a way for us to understand our context. So before we get started, though, I just want to quickly just to kind of reiterate what Ken said in terms of the level of comfort, because again, as I mentioned, I'm going to be asking some fairly deep questions, and I want to make sure that you feel free to participate in whatever way you feel supported, whether it's reactions, chat. I'm not going to have any breakout rooms because I'm just not a breakout room kind of girly, but whatever level you feel, I hope that you will engage. One thing that I would like you to think about as we go through this session is some kind of takeaway. And so the framework that I like to use comes from Jennifer Gonzalez's work over at the Cult of Pedagogy. And she has a framework called Thoughts, Questions, Epiphanies. And she summarizes that as the TQE. And what I like about the TQE is that it really helps students to give a bit of a framework as they're listening to whatever material or whatever they're reading, is to have some kind of takeaway at the end, whether it's something that they want to think about, whether it's a question that they have lingering, or whether it's this aha moment of, wow, I did not see that coming, an epiphany. So I will be coming back to this at the end of our session. So I hope that as we go along, if you come across a TQE that you'd like to share at the end, that you will jot it down and we can kind of all share that at the end together. And this is also a one thing I also like about our organization here is we're always learning how to make our teaching even better. So this is another little takeaway that you might be able to use in your own classroom. So what I'd like to do today is I'm going to continue what I started last year here at Equity Unbound, which is when I first started talking to you about some of the conclusions of my research, but I'm going to extend it beyond where we started last year. So we're going to look at 4 questions today, and we're going to really be thinking about how do we not only identify where we are, but how do we continue going forward? Because the work I did last year was really about having a new understanding of our conditions, having an understanding of the landscapes that we are a part of, and recognizing what we can control and what we cannot control. But by the time I finished my dissertation, it was a much more hopeful argument than I thought it was going to be. And it's all about how do we, once we recognize the terrible conditions we might find ourselves in, how do we keep going on? So we're going to, in order to do that, we need to first understand what is meaningful. What do we need to keep doing in order to have our conditions continue? And then also, how do we reorient ourselves when we find ourselves out of place? So throughout this presentation, you're going to be seeing pictures of some of my favorite landscapes. And the landscape that meant the most to me in my work was the native prairie landscape, which is where I come from here in Saskatchewan, the province. And the picture you'll see right now is of a purple cornflower that's no longer purple because it was in the dry season on the prairies. But you're going to see lots of examples of vegetation and this landscape that has meant so much to me. So if you were able to attend my workshop last year, this is where we landed last year. It was an understanding of the stories that we carry with us, the stories that we teach by. And in this workshop, we mapped some of the landscapes where we teach. We named some of the institutional pressures that we may face, those that are shaped by visibility and external recognition. We're going to continue a little bit of that today in addition. We also thought about some of the pressures that had settled into our identities and what we started to believe about ourselves because of these external forces. But then we also looked at some of the internal drivers that we had. Like what are the roots that we tend to set down? And what are some of the challenges that we have ahead of us, whether it's in the path ahead of us or in the weather conditions that we can't necessarily control? So last year's work was mainly about recognizing where we are and learning to see our landscape more clearly. But we're going to continue the discussion going forward today. So this is where I want to open the discussion to you all, and I want you just to kind of think about it for a couple of minutes. What has changed in your academic landscape over the past year? So remember when we talked about landscapes before, we were talking about different types of landscapes. We were talking about institutional landscapes, relational landscapes, personal landscapes, academic landscapes, right? Thinking of landscapes as a type of context. The landscape you see on the slide before you is of the native prairie landscape. This is a trail I like to walk called the Valley of a Thousand Devils. And you will see a handful of trees, if that. It's a very stark kind of environment, but a very underestimated, resilient kind of environment. So I'm going to open up the chat. I'm going to, at your level of comfort, I'd really like you to take a moment to think for a second about what has changed in your academic landscape over the past year. Maybe you've gotten a new position, maybe you're at a new institution, maybe you've got a different position at that institution, maybe you just have a new mindset about it. But if you have a moment, I want to give you just a quick minute to think about it. And if you're comfortable, throw it in the chat and I will hush for a second to let you all think about what could have possibly changed for you over this last year in your academic landscape. So far, I see someone wrote colleagues and leaders, so changing in leadership. I've had that recently too. We have a new director in our unit. So that's going to be interesting to see how that will shift the landscape. Some things I control, some things I cannot control. Yasser writes, my thinking currently incorporates the loss of funding opportunities and increasing reliance on AI, right? More broadly and in terms of the too much embracing, right? So we've talked a lot about this extreme, this shift of paradigm we have, whether it's pro or con, and I can really sense that too. Yeah, so there's definitely some shifts happening in our landscape for sure. Quick question here. How often does the work that matters to you the most receive recognition? Okay, so think about the things. Oh, there's a couple other, I want to look at the other chats. Let me just pause for a second here. I'm gonna go back. So I can go back in the slide. Here we go. Let's go back here. I want to make sure I honor everyone else's that put it in the chat here. So Ken writes, after 30 years of teaching software engineering in Mexico, I have been through so many changes. My current mode is mentoring our younger faculty as I cruise into retiring a few years from now. That is a big shift in your landscape, isn't it, Ken? I think it's a huge one. Did you want to, could you speak, would you feel comfortable enough speaking a little bit more to that? Because I think it's such an interesting example.
No, I think it's just I've been around a long time and
Hmm.
I've seen so many changes. An
Hmm.
excellent part about our institution is we are quick to change, like very quick to
Mm.
change, and it's
Hmm.
great. Except you're constantly changing, and you're not kind of
Yeah.
cruise moded like in other institutions. But
Hmm.
yeah, I've just switched into more of a management role in terms of other faculty. So it's a good place to be,
Hmm.
and I enjoy it very much. And I think it's a service that I can offer for younger faculty.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And I love that you see this as an opportunity, right? And sometimes it can be
Mhm.
really easy to have the mindset shift into a place that's more negative. So I
Hmm.
appreciate recognizing the fact that you can use your knowledge of the landscape to help others experience of it, which is, I think, what we want to do as educators. So thanks for sharing that, Ken.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
thanks.
And someone else writes, my institution made a partnership with Copilot and rolled that out to all staff. I got a new line manager. I was rejected in a couple of postdocs. Oh, those are hard, hard parts to your landscape. Thank you for sharing those because it's tough. It's tough when, especially when you have challenges when you want to do the work that you feel called to do and you're not getting that uptake. So big hugs. Heather writes, I'm working full time and coordinating and teaching different courses. Lots of new inputs on your landscape. Hey, Heather. So lots of things for us to think about. And I think for me, understanding my world as a landscape helps me to see it differently than if I thought of it just as a context or as a workplace. It gives it more life and it helps me to understand, again, the things that I can control versus the things that I can't. But the more that I can see the landscape before me, the more I feel like I can engage with it in a way that is important. All right, so let's move on to our poll here. So, thinking about some of the work that you do in your position as an educator, whatever level of education that you or contributions you have here in our academic ecosystem, how often does the work that matters the most to you, the work that really fuels you as an educator, how often does that work receive recognition? Just want you to think about that for a second and don't put it in the chat quite yet. We'll do a little quick chatter fall. Okay, let's do a quick chatter fall all at one time. But really think about that. And I'm going to answer this question too at the level of your comfort. Think about what really drives you as an educator. And does that work get recognized? And if it does get recognized, how often does it get recognized? Does it get recognized a lot, often, sometimes, rarely, or are you uncertain? So let's all type it in and don't hit enter quite yet. I'll give you another quick. I'm the worst at wait times on Zoom, so I will try my best to give you all a second to wait. All right. Again, the visibility of our work. How often does the work that makes us go forward, how often does that get recognized? Are y'all ready? All right, let's hit enter. All right, I'm seeing a combination of rarelys and sometimes. I don't see a lot of oftens. Don't see a lot of oftens. And what does that mean? Uncertain. Okay. Carry that uncertainty. Hopefully by the end of this session, you're going to have a little bit more of an understanding of that. I appreciate that honesty, right? It's hard sometimes when we think about that disconnect of the work that really helps us go forward and then it not being recognized. I appreciate, though, Ken's caveat that he writes to rarely, but I'm okay with that, right? And that sounds to me as someone who knows their landscape and understands that sometimes the work that we do might not get seen. So again, going back a little bit to what I talked about last year, the fact that we have different kinds of landscapes that we move through every day that we're on campus, whether we're on site or online, right? We've got various institutional landscapes we have to navigate, whether it's new leadership, policies, assessments, formats, all of these things, relational landscapes, the relationships we have with students, with our colleagues, with the institutional leaders. We have our own personal landscapes we bring into the classroom. A big part of a big influence on my research has been Parker Palmer's work, where he speaks about we teach who we are. And I think that's been a big part of what I've noticed in Equity Unbound is we're not afraid to talk about our humanity as educators. We're not just the walking brain in the room. We do have our own personal things that we bring into our situations. And a big part of my research that I'm going to be sharing with you today that will hopefully help you see your landscape a bit differently is this idea of the performance model, the performance model. And the performance model came out by Jane Tompkins in the 1990. This is 20 years after Freire's um, the pedagogy of the oppressed, where he discussed the banking model. So if you're not familiar with the banking model from Freire, a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire wrote about the banking model as a very top-down kind of educational model where we pour in the information into our students. And so it's the sage on a stage where the students are the empty vessels that we deposit information into, right? So this came out in the 1970s. 20 years later, Jane Tompkins comes around and says, well, in North America, we're not quite as rigid necessarily in the way we set up our classrooms. She said that we instead in North America were more guided by what she labeled the performance model. And so the performance model, rather than imitating your teacher and seeking to get their approval through imitation, what Jane Tompkins wrote about is the performance model seeks to achieve approval from others. And so instead of seeking to be like the person who's teaching us, we want to be liked, right? I want to get their approval. And so it really values this visibility of our actions because the visibility of our actions leads to that approval. It emphasizes productivity and competition, often at a cost. So I'm not going to be spending too much time here on the performance model, but I think it's something important that we see because when I began my work, I thought the point of my work would be, how do I destroy this model? How do I blow it up? Because I was so angry and so upset. Actually, the article that this model came out of was called Pedagogy of the Distressed. And I was somebody who was very distressed in my pedagogy. And I thought, well, let's blow it up. But then the longer I sat with it, the longer I thought about it, the longer I talked with other educators in my landscape, the more I recognized that I'm actually a part of the performance model. When I have to mark students, when I have to sit on hiring committees, when I do all these structures that are part of the system that we're all members of, I'm complicit in the performance model. So what do I do with that? How do I live with that? And so that's kind of what I'm going to be speaking to a little bit here today, is I'm not going to be dwelling on the negative effects per se of the performance model and how it shapes our experience in education. But I do think it's important for us to pause to recognize those moments when the performance model takes hold, because once we recognize those moments, we can be empowered to move through them. So moving on, oh, whoops, a little bit fast. Okay, so I think a big part of my argument is recognizing these influences on our lives, right? So first, recognizing what are those conditions that shape our lives here in the academy, what sustains us going forward, and what really keeps us rooted in our work. And being rooted in our work is a really important part, I think, of surviving landscapes that might not be the friendliest context that we find ourselves in. So I spoke to this in another workshop earlier this month with some other educational developers, and I really started to hone in on these three layers of our landscapes around us. We've got what is the visible parts of our work that people really see and value, what becomes the essential parts of our work that really keeps us going, and then ultimately what keeps us rooted. Like, what is it something that keeps me in the work that I'm doing, keeps me going as I move on forward? And that's what I'm hoping we're going to come up with some answers to by the end of this session. So here's our first little activity I'm going to get you all to do. And this is where you're going to need to use the link that's in the chat. Hopefully someone can put it, hopefully May or Ken or Yasser can throw that link again in the chat. Thank you. I'm going to want you to click onto the Google slide here, and I'm going to give us about 3 minutes to fill out the slide. If you're not a fan of music, this is a really lighthearted lo-fi music, so hopefully it won't be too upsetting. But if it is, you can just mute. But I like to have a little timer in my slides, 'cause like I said to you before. Otherwise, won't. I will just not have any kind of wait time. So I want to make sure I give you enough wait time to fill out this slide. And so what this slide is asking you to do is to really think about what work does the performance model value the most? Okay, so think about the work in academia, in education, where you find yourself. What work do you do that you find becomes the most visible, that gets rewarded? So it could be publications, it could be looking busy, it could be whatever it is that people tend to value in the context you find yourself in. And, oops, I don't think I had it right. I will just play the timer here. How about that? And I will let you all fill out that slide. Sound good? Can you see it? Can you see my screen okay? Yeah? Okay, I'm gonna hit
Yeah,
the
we're
timer.
good.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. Feel free to go to that slide and fill it out. Thanks. All right. I'm going to stop sharing so I can reshare with all of your great insights. Let me just figure out where I'm at. I was 19 seconds early. Sorry, everyone. I'm not sure why my timer didn't actually show up. Let's go to our slide here and I will see what you all have put. So one thing I wanted to quickly say before we review what you all have contributed, and please feel free to continue adding to it if you'd like. Um, I don't want to make a simplistic opposition between visible work and meaningful work. That's not what I'm trying to do here. Oftentimes, I feel like it sometimes gets reduced to that in the on the landscapes we're a part of. I don't think the problem is the visibility itself. I think the problem is when visibility becomes the measure of worth. And I think sometimes we can lose sight of what's important in our work. And that's why it's important for us to kind of reorient ourselves to first acknowledge what is it that gets recognized the most in academia. So let's have a look at the slide to see what some of you have written. And if you feel like you'd like to speak to that, please raise your hand and I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to speak more to some of these that we see on the screen here in front of us. Publications, academic titles, right? I'm somebody who I started this by telling you about my academic title. And when I said it though, I felt like I wasn't saying it to brag because I know this community and I know this community will celebrate it. But sometimes we may find ourselves in situations where titles aren't about celebration, they're about prestige. And I can see that being a challenge, right? Partnerships with government agencies, yeah, that could definitely be is visible and it's an achievement, but is it as much of an achievement as others? It depends on the measure of scale, I guess, right? Open access resources. Yes, yay. Grants, teaching evals, outreach, grant successes, evaluation scores, retention numbers, so many things here. Would anyone like to speak a little bit more to some of the work that really irks you or frustrates you about the academy that tends to get more celebrated than others? Would anyone like to speak to that at all before we move on? I don't want it just to be my voice. Yes, Kathy, thank you.
I was just thinking how I think things, different things are getting valued now, positive things. So where I work, our promotion criteria have just been changed to include openness as part of the criteria. And yeah, that seems to me to be taking things away from that competitive nature
Mm-hmm.
that we've
Mm-hmm.
always had in academia and
Mm-hmm.
making things, yeah, sharing is now to be appreciated and valued, which I'm really pleased about.
It's nice to see those shifts, hey? And it's not a huge shift, but it's just a shift in priorities, you know? And it's nice when you can actually notice the positive shifts and not always the negative shifts, for sure. All right, conferences, enrollments. There's so many things here. We could spend the rest of the session there, but what I really appreciate about my work is it didn't let me stay in the negative, right? Because as I'm speaking with the people who participated in my study, I found that they weren't negative. They were actually quite positive in what kept them going, and that's really where I want us to go to next. So the piece you see on the screen here is an embroidery piece that means a lot to me. And I want to speak to the embroidery piece before I ask you the question. So the embroidery piece you see on the screen, this is by an artist who posted this in the natural craft forum online. And I'm someone who likes to stitch. I like to say I like to stab things frequently, my cloth. But stitching is a part of art that I really appreciate and I value. And the stitching you see before you is of two different types of vegetation that you can find. On the right, you'll see a conventional lawn grass that you'll see in most North American or even European, a lot of different suburbias. You'll see this traditional type of lawn grass. On the left, you'll see a different type of vegetation, and this is prairie vegetation. This is native prairie vegetation, and this is where things started to go off for me as someone who is a settler living on these prairie lands. I was fascinated by the idea that on the prairie, two-thirds of what lives on the prairie in terms of plant life is underground. We only see one-third of the plant above the surface because most of the life is beneath the surface. And that became a really powerful metaphor for me, partially because I don't like conventional lawn grass. I'll be completely honest with that. I'm not a big fan of it. Because if you think about conventional lawn grass, um, it's highly resource dependent. You have to water it, you have to mow it. It's invasive, like it's an invasive species, which means it spreads all over. It's I don't know, I'm just not a big fan of it. I do like this idea though of the native prairie life because when you go out on the native prairie space, what you the more that you pause to really look at that space and to look at that plant and to see how much that plant has weathered and gone through, it really got me thinking a lot about my academic life and a lot of the challenges and landscapes that I've had to move through, and how the longer that I'm here and the more secure I become in who I am as an educator and my identity, the deeper my roots are. You know, earlier Ken spoke about how he sees his transition into becoming more of a mentor. Well, it's probably because Ken's got a lot of good roots that he's ready to share with others, right? And I'm excited to share with you some of these findings that I've come across here as I've thought about how to survive a pedagogy of the distressed. So the question I have on the screen says, what happens when visibility becomes the primary way of recognizing value? Okay, so just sit with that for a second. I know Yasser also spoke earlier about the rise of AI tools. And the thing that I've noticed in my classroom a lot lately is that AI really values product and not so much process, right? And product is visibility, right? So when a student hands me their report, I teach technical communication. When they hand me their report, I'm not necessarily grading the process unless I'm looking for the process, right? I'm looking at the product. And so, how do we start to counter this society that tends to value product over process, visibility over values? I think it really requires a mindset shift. It really requires us to do some deep thinking about who we are and who we want to be in the environments we find ourselves in. Part of that is recognizing where we are, but part of that is also recognizing what do I need to do to continue to be who I want to be in the system where I find myself. So visibility is not the same thing as value. And I know that may seem really obvious, but I think that unless we are what Maxine Greene, the educator from the 20th century, said, we have to be wide awake. We have to force ourselves to be conscious to the world around us. And so if we're not wide awake and recognizing the landscape we're a part of, I think it could be really easy to see the visible, see the outputs, see the recognition, see the productivity, and see the completion as the endpoint, right? But we're not thinking about what are the roots beneath that surface that got us to the visible product, right? So when it comes to the outputs, what is the value beneath that output? Like when I successfully complete a project, maybe I successfully completed that because of the relationships I had with my research colleagues, with my students, with the relationship I have between myself and my own words, myself, my own ideas, right? Oftentimes the output doesn't take time to look into that. Looking at recognition, thinking about elements of care, elements of learning with productivity, elements of growth with completion, right? It's not just the title that I celebrate in getting my PhD. In all honesty, it's the growth that I've had since having taking on this project. I really feel like that to me was way more valuable than the title I got at the end of my degree experience. So moving forward, I want you to start thinking, and we're going to do a reflective activity here in just a moment. That's going to be about 5 minutes long. And I hope that you will take the time to really do some deep thinking about your own personal practice here. And I want you to think about the work that you do that feels meaningful to you, whether or not it receives recognition. Okay, so think about the space that you're in. And so whether it's your own personal research, whether it's connected to your job, it doesn't even have to be academic, to be honest. It can be any kind of work. But then I also want you to think what kind of work helps you to feel connected to the kind of educator, scholar, colleague, or person you want to be. Because it's not just the work itself, but you really have to think about what helps you to get that work done. Because I think that's the missing part I had last year was yes, you can recognize where you are, but how do you keep going? Well, you got to also understand what fuels you, what keeps you going. Here's an example, because this is what I'm going to be asking you to do in just a moment, is I'm going to ask you to identify these three levels, okay? So for me, a big part of my meaningful work as a teacher of communication is to give students careful feedback, meaningful feedback when they're struggling. So where I teach in a college of engineering. And I teach technical communication, but I teach it from a rhetorical perspective, which means it's highly relational, highly audience centered. And it's scary for a lot of these technical students because these technical students tell themselves, I'm not a good communicator. This isn't important to me. I don't care about this, right? And so I have a lot of work to do in terms of helping them unwrite the stories that they're carrying in with them. But that kind of work takes time, takes emotional labor, right? It takes that labor that doesn't get accounted for often in the course hours that we are given, especially if you really want that feedback to land for a student. I remember when I was going through my English degree, I used to have a page of notations next to me because that's how my teachers would grade, is they would just leave little initials and abbreviations. And so they would be like a CS. And I'd have to go, okay, what's CS? Oh, comma splice. I see how they're nodding, right? Oh, comma splice, right? And yes, I mean, I guess it was helpful on one level because yes, that was a comma splice, but it didn't tell me why should I fix it. It just said that's a comma splice, right? Whereas for myself, when I give feedback to a student, I try to respond as a reader. And I try to say, okay, this is a comma splice, and I don't understand what's important, and it sounds really choppy, right? And so that they hopefully can internalize that, but that takes me more time than just writing CS in the margin, right? I do this, why it matters to me is I really want students to understand that they can grow, they can change. It's hard, and I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but if they take the time to really think about it, it's going to help them. That's going to sustain them if they're able to continue on. And the values that are beneath this practice of mine of why I want to do this really kind of go back to a pedagogy of kindness. Really, that's where I really I follow Kate Denial's work at the pedagogy of kindness. I think care, dignity, belief in learning, empowerment, all of these are important parts to making sure students feel seen. So this is where I want you to do a little bit of extra work now. And I want you to really do some deep thinking at the level of your comfort. But this really helped me to start understanding impossible situations a little bit better, is to really think about what is some of that not so visible work that means so much to you and the context that you find yourself in. So identify first, what is the action itself? What is the work? And then really think beneath that surface, right? What's beneath that surface of why does this work matter? Why does it matter for you to do that extra time that might not get recognized broadly? And then underneath it, I want you to really think about what's the value underneath there? The value that motivates that practice. Is it equity? Is it justice? Is it whatever value you'd like? You could do a quick Google search for a list of values if that would help. But I'd like you to really think about this three-part framework. And I'm going to give you a good 5 minutes to really think about what this means to you. And so on your own, I don't have a place for you to actually record this because I think this is really kind of your own kind of work to do. But I do hope that someone might feel comfortable enough to share with us at the end of this 5 minutes. Before I hit the little timer, do we have any questions? Oh, and thank you. Ken's put it in the chat as well, if that would be helpful. Any questions before we get started? All right, do some good thinking here because I really think this can be valuable work for us, especially when you find yourself really overloaded. It can be really hard to shift our focus to what really matters. And so I hope this will be a useful activity to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you when we come back. So let's see if my timer works. It does. See you in 5. The use of narrative inquiry. I'm going to start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back. And I hope you had some good time to reflect. Um, I was saying that one of the big parts of my research methodology involved narrative inquiry, which as soon as I discovered this method, I thought, oh, I could do this. I could be a researcher because it really spoke to me because it really helps us to understand our life as a story. And I think that once we can see our lives differently, whether it's seeing our context as a landscape or seeing our lives as a story, I feel like it gives us more power to and more autonomy to kind of shape who's the person telling my story, how can I change this cast of characters? How can I change the plot line? Am I my own unreliable narrator, right? Really to kind of give you just a little bit of a perspective. And I think when we think of these 3 questions, these 3 areas I've asked you to identify, I hope you can see how, if we're not careful, the answers we give to these questions can set up a story for ourselves if we're not careful. One of the theorists I used in my work was the educator John Dewey, who was all about experience, right? And how experience is the ultimate teacher. And part of what he spoke to in his theory is he talked about how if we're not careful, we can fall into what he called miseducative storylines. Miseducative. And miseducative are these storylines that we tell ourselves that we can get stuck in, that these stories are not helpful, they're not productive, they actually stop growth because they're not they're not educative. They're not going to lead to that understanding. They get us stuck. And I think that's one thing I recognized in the work that I was doing was that there were many times I found myself stuck. And the reason why I was stuck was the story I was telling myself, right? And not feeling like my work was being valued and not understanding why I did the work I did and who I was doing the work for, right? Who was my audience? Is my audience my colleagues who may not understand me? Is my audience the students before me in my classroom, right? I really understood that I had a lot more power than I thought. So I asked you all to spend a good 5 minutes really kind of thinking on your own about things that matter to you. So I asked you to think about meaningful work. So what's one part of your work that matters so much to you, that matters a lot, deeply? Then I wanted you to take it another level deeper and then to ask yourself, why does that work matter? Like, what's behind that work? What drives you to do that additional work? And then, even deeper than that, what's the underlying value that sets you up when it comes to the work that you find so important? So, I'm not sure if anyone feels comfortable enough to either share in the chat or to raise your hand, but I would love to open the floor and the space to hear some of your reflections if you feel safe enough to share them here about really getting beneath the surface of what drives us in our practice as educators. Does anyone feel comfortable enough to share? Or in the chat? Chat also works. Yeah, sir. Great, thanks.
Well, I'm reflecting on these three reflective pieces, and I've been thinking too much about my advocacy for accessibility and how the current
Hmm.
frictions that I experienced in my schooling, moving forward to my first encounter with higher education before I
Hmm.
shifted to the institution that I did, which is AUC. Uh, I'm thinking that about this, and I think that this work is really important, that we need to have more advocates, and this is probably why it
Hmm.
matters. It matters
Hmm.
because there are people who are more unprivileged than me.
Yes.
They need the focus and attention that I give to this community. There are people
Hmm.
who have less access to routes that I got access to. There are people who have even
Hmm.
less access to a lot of resources, be it
Hmm.
financial, be it technology, be it communication, be it an ability to talk to people from different backgrounds and diverse perspectives.
Hmm.
And this is why I think it matters. And to strand everything together, I'm thinking also that about the value, and I think that the value that should govern, and I hope that it had governed my perspective, is social justice. So
Yes.
hopefully, is, social justice is I think the root
Hmm.
of everything.
That's such a good example, Yasser. I love how do you notice how his example started going deeper and deeper and deeper, right? So like on the
Hmm.
surface, you've got the advocacy of the group, and then you've got the reasons why. And so much of the reasons why, what I heard, Yasser, were connected to your own experience, wanting to make others' experiences better, right? And then underneath that itself was this the whole value of social justice, right? And like for me, understanding the depths of my practices really helps me to understand who I am. And then it helps me to have those roots so that when my landscape is shaken, so yes, or if something were to happen to funding or how this program was viewed, I hope that by understanding that value that secures you, it keeps you going forward in your practice. So I think that's a really helpful example. Thank you for that. Sabin, it's Sabin, right? I hope it's Sabin. I hope I'm saying it correctly. I think it was Sabin. I heard you pronounce it the other day. Sabin writes, meaningful work, researching the scholarship on academic skills as a part of updating online guides on their website. Yes, 100%. Like I get that. You need to show people the skills of this is how we do it, right? But it's not just that why we do it, it's why is it important? Well, it's important because the information we give our learners needs to be backed up by strong evidence base, right? And we need to model our practices. It's not just the way we've always done it. There's a good reason for this, and we need to show you why we're doing this. And the value underneath it, Sibin writes, scholarly research matters so much at a time when misinformation, right? See how much more meaningful it gets when we take that time to look beneath it. It's not just updating the website, right? In some ways, you're countering misinformation, but we really have to be conscious enough, wide awake enough to really understand what motivates us. And so that when we're not recognized, we can keep going. And that's what I really value so much about my work is it's not just recognizing what's broken, but how do we keep going when everything is broken? So, what does your story tell you about your place, right? What does my story about my practice as an educator tell me about my place on the landscape, about who I am? And then the second question to that is when the work that I value is overlooked, ignored, disregarded, what story then am I tempted to tell about my place, right? There's two different questions there, right? And I think the power I found for myself anyway, working in a sometimes unfriendly landscape is that I need to understand more of who I am. And by understanding more of who I am, it shifts the focus, right? So when I started my work, my research, because I wanted to survive. I was like, how do I survive this place? I love this institution, but this institution has broken my heart so many times. How do I survive it? But the longer I started to speak with the participants, the longer I sat with myself and reflected, the more I recognized that it's not about survival, right? So much of our work is really about learning how do we sustain ourselves. And that's what the work I've done has helped me to understand is sustaining is a type of survival, but when you're sustained, it's survival on your own terms, right? Like in order to survive something, I feel like you take the power outside of yourself. Help me survive, right? But in order to be sustained, I set those roots. And so that when challenges arise before me, I can go to those roots and I'm not going to be as swayed. I'm not going to be as gaslit by people who try to tell me a story that is not the story I choose to believe, the story that I choose to live. I know my roots, I know my value, right? Even if that value isn't visible, isn't recognized on where I find myself. But that said, values have to be tended. They have to be tended. And so the picture that you see on the screen here, that used to be my front yard. You'll see it's no longer a front, that used to be grass. It's no longer grass. I was able to this summer. I was able to with my neighbor to able to root it all up and put some native prairie plants in there and some other beautiful flora, and just to be able to enjoy it without having to mow and to do all the resource intensive things with a lawn. When it comes to the work that I'm asking you to do, I want you to understand that the values you carry are personal, but in order to sustain them, we sometimes have to go outside of ourselves. It's not just our own work to do. We need to work with others. We need to work with our landscapes. We need to work with the environments we find ourselves in because it's not just up to us to keep going. So, going back to this metaphor of a landscape that I opened with, I think it's important for us to understand where to find the help that we need when it comes to tending those landscapes that we're a part of. So, when it comes to our personal landscapes, what's the practice that you could do for yourself that will help you to be sustained, that will help your roots take more set in the earth, right? So, whether it's a reflective practice, whether it's setting some boundaries, what's okay, what's not okay, rest is really important. Noticing, having those ways to only speak to you of how you can take care of yourself. For me, it's terrible reality television and stitching. That's what I like to do to take care of myself. But what is it for you? Maybe there's some relational ways that you can help yourself to survive these landscapes or sustain yourself on these landscapes that you're a part of. Relational connections, building trust, having community, feeling encouraged, being witnessed. Community is like equity and bound, right? Where I always feel like I'm included in a part of it, right? Making those efforts to be a part of those connections will help us to take care of ourselves and to tend the landscapes that we're a part of. Oops. Institutional, right? And so what are the ways that we can go outside of ourselves to take care of ourselves, right? So how do we adjust our workload? How do we take care of our autonomy? How do we gather resources? We had a great session last week on liberating structures, which blew my mind, right? And so how do we help ourselves to continue forward outside of ourselves using the institutional resources that we have available to us? One thing that I really valued so much about the research I did was understanding that we're a part of a community. This institution is a community. And I can have a little bit more generosity when I start thinking of it as this community or this ecosystem we're a part of. So rather than dividing it us versus them, we're all part of this. We all have a different role to play on the landscapes that we find ourselves on. So to wrap things up here, we're almost done. I asked you at the very start to really think of a TQE that you could carry with you after the end of this session. So I'm just going to invite you now, if you'd like to raise your hand or throw it into the chat. Did you have a thought, question, or epiphany that you'd like to share with us now before I give you the final takeaway of what I'd like you to think about in the days ahead? So I'll stop here for a moment. If anyone wants to raise your hand or throw it in the chat, what's your TQE for what we've talked about for the last hour? Yes, sir.
One of the things that it's an open thing that I would keep, circling back to is I'm thinking about the word landscapes
Hmm.
in terms of being a metaphor. And
Hmm.
I don't really connect much with the landscape around me, be it the physical landscape.
Hmm.
And I don't really feel like I love touching roses and seeing their different shapes and blooming and sizes and everything. But I never, you know, uh, I never, I'm just trying to find the right word. I never go to see or to
Hmm.
embody those landscapes. So this is the
Hmm.
question that I'm leaving with, is how to
Hmm.
keep thinking about myself in terms of the landscape that I inhabit and how
Hmm.
that landscape would turn up to be something new.
Questions, and to be honest, yes, or if it doesn't resonate with you, that's also okay, right? It's also okay if it doesn't necessarily speak to you. Like you could also think of a different kind of metaphor to help you understand the context you find yourself in. But I appreciate that candidness, right? Like, I think it's important for us to take that beat and to sometimes sit with ideas that don't necessarily land with us right away and see if it
Mm,
does percolate.
it's not a critique on what you said. It's just that my perspective of I thought about
Mhm.
metaphors of AI a lot. This is
Ah, oh,
part
okay.
of what I did. It's never a critique for you. I didn't
Oh,
mean
no.
to pose that, but it
Yeah.
was like more or less that how this word is impacting one's own position in society.
Thank you for that clarification. And even if it was a critique, I didn't hear it as a negative, but I appreciate that clarification for sure, right? Awesome. Thanks,
Yeah.
Yasser. The I just started listening to The Phantom Toll Booth with my children. Oh, what a good book. Oh my goodness. And it's such a great metaphor of how your landscape affects your thinking. Whoops. Your thinking and reconnecting to your values. If you're not familiar, there are places like expectations, and the traveler is told to go beyond expectations or he gets stuck in the valley of the doldrums. Oh, beautiful. I'm going to have to reread that, Thea. I'm going to reread that. That sounds beautiful. But isn't that neat how stories really help us to see our landscapes differently? I love that you shared that. Thanks. Heather writes, I had my annual review earlier today. Ooh, oh, that's tough. And everything I reported to my boss was visible, although I did focus on the impact. Ah, see, you're already halfway there on certain points. Next year, I want to reflect on the meaningful work, why it matters, and the values beneath it, and report those points to my boss. Thanks, Heather. I'm glad that you had that takeaway. Seven, the question I'm leaving with is, what might be an unreliable narrator in my story, and how will I be able to spot when my narration is unreliable? Oh, that is the life's question, isn't it? I love that question. Well, here's something that I put together for you all to think about as you leave in the days ahead. When the landscape around you tells you this, what do you want to remember and why? Right? And so when the landscape tells you you're not enough, what do you want to remember? And why, right? And so oftentimes the landscape I find myself in and some of my with my immediate colleagues is they tell me that I'm not important or my ideas aren't good or my ideas aren't useful, right? But I want to remember my roots and I want to remember why I do what I do and why I teach the way I teach and what makes me me because of the values I have. And the value that really underlines my practice is competence. I want to have my students be competent. I want to be competent, and all of that fuels me going forward. But I really have to think about who I am. And when I know, the more I know who I am, the more I feel secure in going forward with what I have to do in my life. So I know that we're at the top of the hour. I invite you all to contact me. I think I'm already friends with a lot of you already on LinkedIn, but I'm also on Blue Sky. And yeah, I hope that this has been a useful session for you and that you will take some of these ideas and you'll reflect on them. And hopefully, you won't have the pedagogy of the distressed that I was feeling when I started this work. Because even though my job has in some ways gotten a lot harder, I feel like I'm able to handle it because I know who I am. And knowing who I am makes me strong. So thank you all for coming this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are in the world. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who joined us.
Yes, thanks. Stay tuned.
Thank
Hopefully
you
this will
so
become a
much.
book. This will become a book hopefully someday. We'll see.
Awesome. I will stop the recording now.